Hello. Just over 3 years ago, in fact about 3.5 years ago, I had an operation on my big toe joint that effectively fused or stiffened the joint so that it couldn't bend. Now, I've been suffering from a condition called Hallux Rigidus, a type of arthritis that affects the joint at the base of the big toe. And it's characterised by pain and stiffness in that metatarsophalangeal joint, which I think we'll just refer to from now on as the MTP joint. And it makes it difficult to actually bend and move the toe. Now, Hallux Rigidus is a form of osteoarthritis, or wear and tear arthritis. And experts estimate that around 1 in 40 adults who are older than 50 have Hallux Rigidus. It's the most common type of foot arthritis. Now, I made a video about Hallux Rigidus at that time, and it raised a huge amount of interest. And many of you had apparently experienced similar problems with your toe joints and are wondering if fusing the joint would actually fix things and allow you to get back to your previous levels of activity. Well, I made a second video about a year after my operation, and I thought it would be maybe a good time now, 3.5 years on, to let you know how things were progressing. Did the fusion work? Was there a downside? Were there any downsides? Does having a toe joint that has been stiffened stop you from being as active as you once were? Hopefully this video will answer those questions and may answer some other questions too. But first, let me go right back and remind you why this condition was such a problem. Now, before I do that, it's important to remind you that I am not a doctor. I'm not a podiatrist. I have absolutely no medical training at all. I'm just an aging mountain bum. What I'm discussing here is something that happened to me, how I dealt with it and how it all turned out. Now, this is not medical advice. What I did may not be the best for you, so please consult a physician before undertaking any kind of treatment. And what worked for me may or may not work for you. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, let's look back at a wee bit of the history surrounding this particular problem I had. When I first experienced Hallux Rigidus, I'd been hill walking regularly, 2 or 3 times a week, and all my holidays and weekend breaks and whatnot were taken up by hiking long distance trails in various parts of the world. I'd been mountaineering and hill walking since I was a teenager. I'd climbed all the Munros 3 times over. I climbed all the Corbetts. I'd walked lots of long distance trails. In short, I was an experienced and seasoned outdoor guy. And it was on one of these hiking trips on a week-long backpacking expedition in Jordan that I first really experienced the discomfort. And at the time I put it down to the heat. A month or so later, I walked across Scotland from Knoydart to Montrose, and on one day in particular, walking across the Corryarrick Pass between Fort Augustus and Laggan, my toe joint became so painful. I seriously thought about pulling out and going home, and it wasn't hot weather, it wasn't warm at all. Now, I changed into some lightweight trail shoes at the time, and that helped. That allowed me to complete the walk, but my toe joint continued to be painful. And eventually I decided to seek help. Now, I was suffering from some other foot issues at the time that may or may not have caused or been affected by the arthritic toe joint. So I decided to consult a podiatrist, and the first guy I saw was really, really helpful. He diagnosed the arthritic toe joint and plantar fasciitis and said he could fix both. Great. He had some expensive orthotics made for me that, to be honest, didn't really help. Were quite uncomfortable. And I stuck with him for a while, then discovered my podiatrist had actually retired. So I went to see another podiatrist who suggested a series of cortisone injections into the joint. And these would cost a couple of £100 a time. So, miserable bugger that I decided to see what the good old National Health Service could offer. My GP arranged for me to see an orthopaedic consultant, and he also suggested a series of cortisone injections into the joint, which the consultant agreed with. And thanks to a wonderful National Health Service, these were free and worked fairly well for a few months at a time, but actually only relieved the pain. The cortisone didn't stop the joint from degenerating further. And eventually my consultant couldn't get the needle into the joint. The cartilage had all but gone and the joint was rubbing bone on bone. It's very, very painful. Now, at this stage, even a 2-mile ramble became a real test of endurance. And on one occasion, when I had to stop walking after 10 minutes or so, I decided I had to take things a step further. Now, my consultant arranged for further x-rays, and he suggested he pass me on to one of his colleagues who actually specialised in foot issues. But after waiting 6 months for an appointment with the specialist, I discovered it was likely to be 2 years before I'd get an initial consultation. The downside of a brilliant but overworked and underfunded National Health Service. Now, by this time, I was getting pretty desperate. I had earned a living for some 40 years by climbing mountains and writing about it. Now I could barely stumble to the bottom of the road where I lived. My podiatrist suggested I speak to a private surgeon and recommended a guy called Robert Clayton, a consultant orthopaedic surgeon now in private practice. He's apparently one of the UK's leading foot and ankle surgeons. And he had an office in Glasgow and he carried out his operations at a private hospital in Stirling. So that kind of suited me just fine. So for the price of an x-ray, which was about £100, I could actually look at the joint that was causing all my problems. And it was quite evident, even to my untrained eye, that the joint was completely knackered and probably well beyond repair. Now, if I'd caught the problem, just a bit earlier, it may have been possible to repair it with a thing called a Cartiva implant, a kind of artificial joint, which Robert Clayton, in fact, introduced in Scotland in 2016. But the disintegration of my toe joint was too advanced. The cartilage was more or less completely gone and bone was rubbing on bone. So Mr. Clayton suggested the best course of action, his opinion, and one that would eventually allow me to return to my mountaineering and hill walking, would be to fuse the joint, stiffen it so that it didn't bend at all. Now, he confirmed that this particular injury had probably been caused by years of running down steep mountain slopes, probably in boots that may have not been tightened enough over the instep, or in boots that were too narrow at the front, causing my toes to slide down and be crammed into the front of the boots. And it's quite interesting that for years I had used Italian boots that had a particularly narrow last and were almost pointed at the toe. And it's perhaps not surprising that many mountaineers of my generation have suffered similar problems. Anyway, 3 weeks later, it was all done and dusted. I was in and out of a private hospital in about 5 hours or so, with strict instructions as to what I could do and what I couldn't do in the following weeks. I had to wear a special boot for about 6 weeks that prevented my toe joint from bearing any weight. And after that, I could wear normal footwear and start walking again. And I remember those first tentative steps well. And at that time, I didn't think there was any way I would ever climb a mountain again. But I persevered, walking just a little bit further every day until after about 6 weeks, I could climb a wee hill close to where I live called Craigbeg. It's just under 2,000 feet. Now, during that 6 weeks, the bones on either side of my toe joint fused together, aided by some metal pins that brought the two bones together. And here's the x-ray of my fused toe joint. You can clearly see the pins. Now, what is interesting is this: despite the fusion, there's still a certain amount of flexibility in my foot, enough to allow me to walk and even run normally. And the thing that gives that flexibility is the toe's small joint, the wee joint closest to the tip of your toe. Now, that little joint still flexes. The only problem is that it now has to work much, much harder than it did previously, and it takes a lot more pressure. And this, I found, is one of the downsides of toe joint fusion or arthrodesis. That's the name of the operation. And even now, over 3 years since my op, if I have a particularly long walk, that little joint can become quite painful. Now, when I say painful, I mean a kind of niggling pain that I can virtually ignore until I become really very tired and it becomes a bit more painful. And that's when it feels like an issue. But it's nothing that'll prevent me from walking. And a couple of ibuprofen generally sorts it out. Now, it could be that your gait will change, and that might bring some problems because you're putting pressure on muscles or ligaments that you didn't before. But stick with it until your body gets used to the new gait, the new way of walking. That little joint in my toe niggled for a good 3 years, but it only bothers me now when I'm particularly tired after a particularly long walk. Most of the time, I don't even notice it. So, okay, what other downsides are there? Well, I can't ballet dance, but I never could anyway. And I find walking without shoes quite uncomfortable. Barefoot walking isn't really all that pleasant anymore. It's not painful, just uncomfortable. I really need the structure and the natural rolling motion of a fairly stiff sole to allow me to walk naturally. Nowadays, I tend to use either Hoka or Keen footwear, and I'm sure that there's other brands out there that I'd find comfortable too, but these two brands offer the degree of sole stiffness that I find works for me. I also find it difficult wearing sandals. You know, the crossover straps over the forefoot tend to sit just above the joint I had fused, and it rubs. That MTP joint has a little bone spur that's appeared, and the sandal straps tend to rub on it. But I can live without sandals. It's no real issue. I think the biggest issue with the fused big toes is trying to stand up after I've been sitting and lying on the ground. You know, like getting out of a small backpacking tent. Normally you get up in one foot, then bend the forefoot of the other foot to allow you to push up on it. But if you can't bend that forefoot, it becomes really difficult. Let me show you. Ever seen a camel trying to stand up? Well, that's how I feel sometimes. So how long will the fusion last? Well, who knows? People have lived with fused joints for much of their lives, and I haven't heard of anyone yet who has actually broken the joint. But having said that, I guess there's always a first time, and people break bones all the time, so it's not impossible. For me personally, fusing this big toe joint of mine worked incredibly well. I certainly haven't experienced even a hint of pain in the MTB joint, and most important for me, it's allowed me to walk naturally, walk far and walk high. I can ride a bike without any concerns at all, and I can even jog, although to be fair, I'm not really sure why I'd want to. There was a period in my life when I felt my hill walking days were well and truly over. I went through a long grieving period. It was like a death in the family. It was awful. But this arthrodesis procedure, fusing the big toe joint, gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. So if you're suffering from Hallux Rigidus, be assured it doesn't herald the end of an active life. You might not be able to tiptoe around like Wee Willie Winkie or do a pirouette on the tips of your toes to the music of Rachmaninoff, but you will be able to walk or run again, and without that excruciating pain. Now, before I finish, I know there's one question that you're all kind of desperate to ask. How much did the operation cost? Well, you can get this op on the NHS for free, but because I earn my living from walking and climbing mountains, I couldn't afford to go for on a long waiting list, so I happily went private, and it cost me £5,000. And for me, that was money well spent, even if it went against most of my Scottish socialist principles. So if you found this video useful, please think about subscribing to the channel. It'd mean a lot to me, and it would really help. And hit that little like button, if you will. And if you want to find out when I've got a new video published on YouTube, hit the little bell and I'll let you know when there's a new one up and running. But for now, thanks very much for watching. Stay safe, stay active, Mind your toe joints, and we'll hope to see you next time. Bye-bye for now.